And we'll get started with the ferns for our topic today. So I'm sharing my screen. Showing you my screen, and here we have some of the ferns, or at least a couple more good representative of the fern. So monophytes are going to be the botanical classification for the ferns, just for your records. And on the screen, you have a different staghorn fern. This one you see on the screen is Platycerium superbum. Superbum meaning superior, much nicer individual than the one we've seen, which is the common staghorn fern. Now, unlike its sister, we have just one single growing shoot, whereas the one that we saw had a few more here and there. But that gives us an example of a good superbum or a different staghorn fern. But in order for us to understand the ferns, we need to go back way in time. We need to go back to the beginning of plants in the planet. And we'll see how they gradually have evolved. They evolved different characteristics that made them superior, made them adapt to their environment, and they're still with us even today. So we have what on the screen, you have the different plants as they have evolved, including the flowering plants. And then we also have the timeline of how many millions of years ago some of those individuals evolved, or we had them since. And then what we start with is just probably a plant, the very first plant that came out of the ocean. It is believed that it was some kind of algae that eventually, as the land dried out and the oceans receded, it found a nice niche to be outside of the water, less competition. And that's the beginning of the plant. So that's going to be the ancestor. And so the ancestor, as it became more complex, it evolved. And it evolved into different types of plants. So this is just a rendition, a drawing of what they think the first plant kind of looked like. So it was just branching. It was able to carry out photosynthesis because just like algae, they have chlorophyll. And then just like algae, the very first land plant had what is known as spores, which is what's going to be used for their sexual reproductions. Algae has swimming spores, so the plants had to figure out a way for them to survive in the land. And so the spores is going to be something that they will use, and that is going to be persistent up to the flowering plant. So just a rendition of what the very first plant may have looked like. So that was the kind of common ancestor that started way bottom here, like 4,035 million years ago. Again, they're speculating that. So then when it branched, decided to branch, and then it gave rise to what we know as either the hornwort, which are more primitive plants. We have liverworts, and then we have mosses. One of the things that we find with these plants is that they do not have a very or extremely sophisticated root system. So the roots are very small and very primitive, not very, very efficient or efficient for their time. But because of that, they don't have a real or efficient vascular system. And that kind of kept them very, very small. So when we look at the actual plant, they're going to be found in areas where humidity is going to be very high, the tropics, because they're still relying heavily on water. And they're going to be very low growing to the ground, because then the water will not have a need to travel too high up because they don't have a real good sophisticated vascular system. But at some point in time, they're going to produce that spore-bearing structure, what they kept from their common ancestor, which are going to be some kind of algae. The body itself, it's going to be green. It's going to be very low growing to the ground. It's probably going to absorb some water through the leaves and some through the primitive root system. So the spores are going to be flying through the air. They're going to land in moist substrate, and that's how they're going to then germinate and become a new individual. So these are some of the hornworth, given the name because of how this spore-bearing structure looks like. And then we have the liverworth. The liverworth because their leaves looks like a liver, and you can see it right here. That is the body of the plant. Also very small, very low growing to the ground. They're still with us, so you normally find them in moist habitat. But at some point, you have this umbrella-looking structure. That is the spore-bearing structure for this plant. That's how it's going to send out the spores, and they're going to reproduce. But we notice now the body, the leaves, all of that is a little bit thicker. It's getting bigger. It's evolving. It's becoming more advanced. And then we have the mosses. There's going to be many, many types here. Some of them are going to cover the ground. They're very dominant in some habitat. But we see here, this clubs that come up from the plant, that is the spore-bearing structure. They have a cap, and when they're ready, the spores are going to burst the cap, and they're going to fly out and hopefully land somewhere where they're going to have moist habitat to germinate and grow. So the mosses are now a little bit more advanced. And then we have a few that have started to develop now leaves or leaf-like structure. So this is still a moss, and you can see the spore-bearing structure that is brown, and they're open, so they have already released some of those spores. And even some, here's a side view of it so you can see the leaves. And a few of them that also started to develop some kind of defense. Excuse me. The leaves are going to be spiny. The leaves are going to be pokey. So if an animal tries to eat it, it's going to get hurt. So even though it looks like an agave or some other plant, it is still a moss that is now becoming a lot more advanced. So that takes care of this category here, which are going to be relatively primitive. And then as they advance and when it kind of branched twice, then this ancestor decided to branch again. And this evolved into what we know as the Lycopodiales, which are the wolf mosses, the Selaginellas, and also the Isoletis, which are going to be a different type of mosses. So when we look at those wolf or club mosses, now we're going to see an advancement in their body. So they're much more advanced. Now we're going to see a stem that may crawl and creep, already some kind of stem, which means they probably have a much better vascular system, more advanced. And then we also going to see the spore-bearing structure are going to be able to get higher and taller. Most likely there will be now more competition by now, and so they have to swing them or send them out higher into the air. So here's a different photograph. Here's from Brazil. So you see the actual body with very tiny leaves kind of cascading, but those club mosses or the spore-bearing structure that looks like clubs, it's going to go higher, and it's going to look almost like small trees. And here's the top of them, which you can see. And here's the Selaginellas. We still have them with us today. Some of them have medicinal properties, at least that's what people use them for. And in the north, in some of the forests, they're going to cover trees, entire trees, and the ground, and a bunch of other habitats. So they're still important to us. Then here's in California, this is Griffith Park. And you see a succulent. This is during the summer. So now the plants have evolved a way to cope with some of the harsh environment. The earth is changing, it's moving, environment's changing. And so now they rely on dormancy. So during the dry periods, during the hot periods, they are going to desiccate and they're going to dry out. So they're going to go dormant. They're going to go to sleep. And as soon as we get some water on them, they'll regain growth, resume growth. They're going to now continue on living. So now we have a method of surviving, which is going to be going dormant and kind of wait out the rough period. So California, and here's where it looks dead, but it's in fact alive. It's just dormant, sleeping, waiting for the rainy season here in California. So that takes care of this category. And then there was a different branching that gives us the fern and also the seed plant. Now we're gonna skip the ferns for this because we're gonna spend more time with them. And so if we look at the seed plant, they speculate that at some point, a fern, which is more primitive than a seed flowering plant, developed some kind of structure, some kind of seed. So it decided to abandon the spores that was very important from their ancestors, and now kind of create a packet known as a seed. And so we have gentiales, we have the conifers or the cone-bearing plants, we have the ginkgo or the ginkgo biloba, we have the sago palms or the cycads, and then the more advanced individuals are going to be the flowering plants. So when we look at some of the gentiales, we have a plant that is known as Mormon tea. It's common throughout the world. It's native to California and some of them in the tropics. So it's just a bunch of twigs, just a bunch of stems, nothing too amazing. But by this point in time, now the plants have developed a very, very sophisticated root system, which means they can absorb nutrients and other important elements from the soil. Now they have developed an extremely sophisticated vascular system that allows the plant to get taller. And they have also developed a cone-like structure. So an area that kind of houses the egg that will eventually meet the pollen and develop a seed. So here is some of the more primitive cones. And the cones are nothing more than modifications to leaves that become rigid and hard and eventually kind of become of a structure. So we have the pollen-bearing structure here. So we know that this is what they refer to as a staminate, or for lack of a better description, a male cone for this individual. So now we have either male cones or female that also aided in genetic diversity. And that's when the plants really diversified and became what we know of them today. And there's my finger in the back, so you can see the scale. The cone is very, very small. And then we have weird plants from the past. This is Wilwitsia mirabilis. At one point in time, it grew throughout the world. Now it is restricted to just the Namibian desert, so in Namibia and Botswana. The photograph is from Namibia. And now we have a very weird plant. We have a plant that now has evolved probably the very first complex leaf. So the crown of the plant or the head is right here. And for this individual, they only produce a pair of leaves for their entire life. So they have just one pair of perennial leaves. The plant can live for hundreds of years. And you can see as time has gone by, they get shredded, they get mangled, they get beaten. But as long as the center is healthy, it will continue on growing the leaf. But that's it. Their entire life, only a set of leaf is going to be produced. And here we see the cones that would either have an egg or the pollen that will allow them to carry out their sexual reproduction. And here's an individual that is probably over 2,000 years of age. And there I am for scale. As they get older, they might begin to branch, and that is why you see more leaves. But each of those branching stems will only have just one pair of leaves their entire life. So over 2,000 years, they live for a long time. They're not in a rush, but restricted now to the Namibian desert, and that's it. That is where you find them in the world, the only place. And then As time went by, they diversified into the cone-bearing structure. That's the pines, the junipers, a lot of these big individuals that during their time, they were the most evolved individuals in the world. And so they dominated the world. And in fact, they still dominate what is known as the temperate forest. Up north, they're going to be the dominant. You go to Alaska, there's only pines everywhere. So they have a woody cone structure that inside is going to house the seeds. And here's the banya because even though there's some more pines in the temperate area, there's going to be some tropical pines. This is from Australia, and this is going to have a gigantic cone that is going to be the size of a pineapple and can weigh that much. And then we have the ginkgo. The ginkgo is a non-flowering seed-bearing plant. So here we have the example of the pollen-bearing structure or the cone. So this will be a male ginkgo. The females will be somewhere else. And this would be the seed. Now, the seed does not originate from a fruit, which means, from a flower, which means that we cannot really officially call it a fruit. It's just a seed that is surrounded by some kind of fleshy structure. So it's just that simple. Here are ginkgo seeds being sold. So they are edible. Ginkgo is what they refer to as a living fossil because the fossil record shows them being spread throughout the world. So during their time, ginkgo dominated the world. And now, as the world changed, they're restricted to just a few mountains in Asia. Ginkgos were discovered as a fossil way before they were seen alive. And so you can find several examples of many plants that they know them from fossil first before somebody happened to stumble upon them. So ginkgo has been eaten by people for many, many, many years. So the seeds are edible and you can buy them either fresh, you can roast them, and they're quite good if you never had them. So ginkgos biloba. And then you have the cycads. Now, they're not palms because palms are advanced flowering plants. But they begin to have some kind of similarity, at least some kind of form, shape to a regular palm tree. But they're not because you're gonna find male or female sago palms. And the male will have a cone that will bear the pollen, and the female will have a cone that would bear the egg that will eventually become the seeds. So here are the two structures for reproduction. As you go around, this cycads, as they are referred to, are going to be restricted to certain areas of the world, and their distribution is going to be very, very limited. Now, here it is on the screen is a collection of different cycads. This is from Lotus Land. And it's probably one of the best places to see them. Some of the yuns, and here's some of the seeds that they will produce. Most of the plants in this category will have a lot of carcinogenics, so they're not good to eat. Even though there is one that claims to be edible, it's still not healthy to eat them in large amounts. And this is one from Africa. And it is only known from these individuals that are male plants. They never found a female plant yet. It can hybridize with a few others, but as far as we know, up to this date, there are no known female plants in the wild from this species. So they have not located them. And so it's just a lonely male living out there by itself, nobody else to be around it. And then we come to this. This is a cycad. And when we begin to see the leaves, we can see that it almost looks like a fern. Characteristic-wise, And for many years, it was grown and people thought it was a fern. It's a fern, it's a fern, it's a fern, because it looks exactly like many ferns. But at some point out of the ground, it decided to cone or produce a cone, which that tells us it is not a fern, it is a cycad. And until they saw the cones, everybody assumed that it was a fern. And so this is where you see the link where a fern became or evolved into what we know as either the cycads or the more advanced plants. And so that would be something like the missing link. And then eventually we get to the more advanced plants that have changed some of their leaves and created what is known as the flower. We have the flowering plants. Here's magnolia. And when we look at the structure for magnolia, it's very simple. We just have modified leaves that decided to produce a pollen, and then some of them that decided to produce what is known as an ovary that will house an egg that will eventually become the fruit and the seed. So, and then we have also an attractive agent, some petals that became colorful, and that's going to be for pollination, because pollination has now played a much bigger role with plants. Here is another magnolia, very simple flower, not too complicated, just a couple of stamens, a couple of stigmas, and that's it. And here's even another one. This is a tulip tree. So we have a bunch of stamens and then just the interior, which will have the stigma and the seeds. So magnolias are believed to be some of the earliest flowering plants. And when you look at their fruit is a very woody cone-like structure, like a pine cone. So you can see how possibly a pine-like ancestor decided to change its fruit to eventually accommodate for an ovary and eventually develop into a fruit, a real fruit. So magnolias do share a lot of characteristics with some of their common ancestor, which are going to be a pine or a pine cone or something like that. So still woody, still looks like a pine cone. So there's the kind of like the missing link. And so that takes care of the flowering plants, which are the more advanced. And we already looked at the more primitive. And so right in the middle, we have the ferns. The ferns that are going to be many of them. And they're not as primitive as the mosses, but they're not advanced as the flowering plants. So the ferns, as a general description, general definition, are going to be known as non-flowering vascular plants. So they have a very good sophisticated vascular system, way better than their previous ancestors. But they do not have a seed or do not have a flower. So they're still primitive in that manner. And so here is from the wild, here's just ferns growing. Their leaves are going to be out there. The leaves are going to carry out photosynthesis, and they're going to allow the plants to live. And here is a very primitive fern. So it almost looks like the very first plant that probably came out of the water. This is a whisk fern. And if you notice, it has the beginnings of a leaf here, just kind of scale-like, but otherwise it's just a stem growing out of the ground. And it's going to reproduce through spores. Whisk ferns, up to this date, we have not figured out how to cultivate it. It just comes up by itself wherever it wants, usually as a weed. I do like it, but nobody has ever managed to get it to grow wherever they want it or wherever it gets planted. So if you see it, take a photograph because it's kind of nice and unusual to see. So here's probably some of the earliest ferns. Now they're getting a large body, which means it has a vascular system, and they're getting a little bit bigger, which means they also have a very good root system. Here's the tip or the tip of the plant, and you can see some of those early leaves, very, very primitive. And that then gave rise to the horsetail. And in the fossil records, there were forests of horsetail, some that grew gigantic. Now they are restricted to some of the tropical areas and or areas where there's going to be a lot of water. There's still the bigger horsetails in the tropics, but nothing like we've seen in the fossil records. Mainly the stem, and at every single joint, you're going to see what should be the leaves. In this case, it's just tiny, tiny scales. But if we look at the structure of the ferns, this is your fern lingo, so that you'll know. Ferns may have a rhizome that's going to be an underground stem that will allow the plant to grow out. Roots are going to be now well developed, so ferns are going to absorb the nutrients, vitamins, minerals, waters through the roots. And then we have the leaf. The leaf for a fern is going to be referred to as a frond. So same thing, same word that you use for the leaf of a palm. So for, fern leaf or frond, frond. And so the frond is going to be divided into two segments. One of them is going to be the blade, which is going to have the leaflets. And then the other, which is just going to be the stem, is going to be known as the petiole. Now, if we look at the leaflet itself, we see that each of those green segments is going to be known as a leaflet, and the stem from the blade is going to be known as a rachis. Just fern lingo, so yeah, you know, if I ever mention rachis, leaflet, then you know what I'm talking about. So that's the fern lingo. And so if we look at this fern, we can see the petiole right here. There's the blade, here's the rachis, here's a brand new leaf, and then here are the stems, the rhizomes that are going to grow underground. And in this case, they look kind of like hairs, but that is the rhizomes. Now here's a bigger individual, and now we have a much more sophisticated stem. They will get thick. In this case, this fern is grown for this characteristic, as well as our squirrel foot fern that you see right here, where we have the rhizomes that are going to come out of the pot. Now they have hair that protects them a little bit more from the sun, the heat, and the weather. And then we have the leaves that will come out. So a perfect example. The leaves for the ferns are going to be different. So they're going to unfurl, and they are known when they're young as fiddleheads because they're going to have the shape of a fiddle, a violin, and they're going to be very fragile, very sensitive, and that is why they're going to be completely covered with hairs that will protect them as the leaves are unfurling. So all fern leaves are going to unfurl as they mature. Here is a different fern, and this one has a little bit of color in all those hairs. Or here we have Australian, no, this is New Zealand, Hawaiian tree fern that has beautiful fiddleheads, and they're completely covered with very soft hair. So those will become new leaves or grow into new leaves, and there's the close-up of it. Now, some ferns are eaten. This photograph is from New York. So back east and around here in California, you might find them kind of pickled. It is common for people to eat a specific type of fern. However, it is not recommended because most ferns are going to be loaded with carcinogenics, and they can cause cancer. If you're going to consume them, try them, eat them, enjoy them, but don't make it as a habit to regularly eat ferns because it's not going to be good for your health. Even this edible one can eventually cause problems. They had to develop those carcinogenics because ferns grew when there were a lot of dinosaurs. There were much bigger animals that could eat them. So they developed that as a way of protecting themselves. And to this date, except for this fern, there are no other ferns that we use for any real food, calories, or anything like that. And there's the fiddlehead, which is a young fiddlehead that we eat as a kind of a vegetable. And so when we look at just the body of the fern, we're going to have the two types of fronds, or sometimes three. We're going to have the sterile fronds because they're not going to do anything but be green and carry out photosynthesis. So here is just an assortment of the different ferns just to show you some diversity, including our bird nest fern, the staghorn fern that we already seen, and a bunch of others, and we'll see tree ferns later on. So all those fronds are going to be sterile. Just photosynthesis, that is the only role they have. A few ferns are going to make baby plants out of the leaves. So this one is Asplenium bulbiferum, which is known as mother fern. And if you see the close-up of the picture, right out of the leaf, the plant is going to be making a baby plant. So if that baby plant happens to fall and land in a moist area, it'll grow like a regular fern. So it's already making clones of itself with the purpose of surviving longer to be able to carry sexual reproduction. So several ferns can carry out this activity of making baby plants of themselves. Here's the superbum, Platycerium superbum, which we can also see the plate fern fronds. So I mentioned one frond is going to be for photosynthesis. In the case of our staghorn, some of those sterile fronds will become the plates. And you can see the plates here, still carrying out photosynthesis, but also now helping with the body of the fern. And here's another, this is the basket fern. And so you have some of the leaf fronds that will become the plate-like structures that will have this hanging basket. And so the other leaf is going to be the reproductive fronds. And the reproductive fronds will have the spore-bearing structures, the same structures that we saw with the ancestor, the mosses and the liverworts and stuff like that. Is now going to be found underneath the leaves of a fern. So depending on the fern, the structure will change, which is going to be important for IDing the plant. And so with our superbum, the staghorn fern, this would be the reproductive fronds that will carry out the production of spores, which is still linked them to the a common ancestor of the algae and the other mosses. So it is moving away from the spores, from the ferns that allow the more advanced plants to develop into a seed that is no longer relying on water, and eventually into the flower and the fruit that becomes, or that makes the flowering plants the more advanced individuals that we know. And here's a close-up for our superbum. Right here, the spore-bearing structure. And just some examples of ferns that I've encountered in my explorations, just to show you how different each one is going to have their spore-bearing structure. So here's kind of divided into segments in the margin of the leaves. Here's margin of the leaves, here's margin of the leaves, and here's margin of the leaves. Just important for IDing them. And here's some more where you can see the spores coming out. And even the horsetail. Horsetail is a true fern. At the tip is going to have a spore-bearing structure. And that's where the spores are going to come out and allow the plant to grow. And here's the close-up of the spore-bearing structure. So horsetail does the same. And so how did the leaves develop? This is something that they speculate. Once again, we saw the whisk fern before, which is only stem. And so in the drawing on the top kind of shows a plant that looks like the whisk fern, that several branches may have developed a skin, and again, like kind of like a duck foot. And this happens in humans where there's skin that may grow between fingers, that eventually got adopted and became the broad area of the leaf. And as time went by, the actual stems became what is known as the veins now in the plants world. So here's kind of the transition to developing that big, broad leaf that was not known with the mosses or some of the more primitive plants. So here's the vein. That would be the ancestor or the modern day stem from that primitive plant. Again, they speculate, they don't know, but they think that this is probably a good idea of how that big leaves came about. And if we look at the spore-bearing structure, the real name is sori. Inside these structures, there's going to be a cap that is going to keep them in place. And you have a catapult. So the spores are going to be produced in a cluster. And when the plant is ready, the catapult is going to launch the spores into the air. They have to go into the air because then they're going to go away and land, find a good substrate to land. So they're going to be ejected into the air, and that's how they're going to disperse. So inside each of these sori structure, there's going to be thousands upon thousands of spores. And here's how they kind of assume as they dry out, that's going to kind of trigger it. And then it's going to open into eventually it's going to catapult and disperse the spores. And that's just a microscope slides. Of course, I did not take those. But here's just, eventually they'll germinate and the new fern will come out as a baby plant that will grow. And this happens to be the house of Dr. Barbara Jo Hoshizaki. She's no longer with us, but she was the fern expert. And there's some really good books by her. She lived in West LA area. And I had a chance to visit her house, which was amazing because it was a lot of ferns everywhere. As time went by, some ferns developed a kind of woody, rigid stem that allowed them to get high. So these are known as tree ferns. And tree ferns can still be found in the tropics. Here's Frank, a previous student of mine. And we have two New Zealand tree fern and one Australian tree fern in the center just for scale. So we have now a very sophisticated stem that is going to be rigid. Now, one of the things that ferns do not have is the ability to grow in girth. So if you notice the stem from the Australian, it's kind of the same girth from top to even above Frank's head and all the way to the base. But somehow they were able to grow very, very tall. And so what happens with time, the stem will produce roots. We're going to produce roots, which will grow to the ground, and eventually root upon root on the stem will broaden the base of that plant, allowing it to support heavier canopy and allow them to get taller and taller and taller and taller. So that's how we got the tree ferns to survive and be able to support themselves. So it is not the girth of the stem like we find in our modern day woody trees. It is the broadening of the base by simple roots that will burst out of the stem. So that's the secret for the tree ferns. The stem is still sold and used. So here is the fern beauty pageant or beauty show. So here is the tree fern stem that is being used as a container. And you go to Hawaii, you see them everywhere. There are also going to be some water fern. This is Azolla. It's a tiny water fern that is important because it has the ability to get nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so it is being used as a natural fertilizer or natural way of enriching the area where rice is grown. So rice is grown in a watery environment. And so Azolla is used to feed the rice organically without any chemical synthetics. So it just floats on top of the water. That's it. You can see the roots just swimming, and that's the entire life. It's a very tiny fern. Whenever you have a chance to go to the tropics, trees are going to be completely covered with ferns. Here's different species of ferns from Brazil. Here's Dr. Barbara Jo Hoshizaki. So this is her greenhouse. and you see different mounted staghorns and a few other individuals that it was probably either the only fern here in the United States or one of the very few rare ferns that she managed to find from her travels. So that's her house. Here is her greenhouse and her benches, and this is where they were propagated. Uh, and even some ferns that are very sensitive to drying out, you can grow them in what is known as a uh, terrarium. So nothing more than a fish tank glass. It keeps higher humidity. And so this is a very rare fern from Puerto Rico that was being grown. And so it's probably the only one that is in existence. And these are some of the ferns that we've grown here in the garden from her house. And then when we look at just ferns in the wild, here are some of the tree ferns. This is coming from Chiapas, Mexico. So I had not made it to Australia yet, but it was nice to see these very large individuals. And as you can see with this photograph of just a random picture of vegetation in the tropics, here's some of the tree ferns being successful in growing amongst the rest of the vegetation. Here are some of the ferns as they're growing, the natural leaf or the first leaves, and right there. Here's just the base side of the forest, and you see the ferns being the dominant individual in the understory. So right at the ground, they make the majority of the plant. And here's a photograph of the close-up of that. This very nice leaf. And just for scale, this is from Colombia. So in Colombia, I had a chance to go and visit an area that was probably one of the most beautiful forests that I've ever seen. Not too many of it, since Colombia has destroyed over 90% of the natural vegetation. So the few remaining spots are very important, including this one that has a beautiful forest of tree fern, and some of them that are a little bit smaller, and such as this one. And along the edge of the roads, you see them just growing on the side, and here in some of the clearings in Colombia. And there's some more right here, and just some more just growing randomly in some of the higher altitudes. So even though ferns are tropical, we're going to say tropical, if you go to the higher altitude over 4,000 meters, that's called Paramo in Colombia, you will find ferns that are will be growing in very cold habitat. And here's in Colombia, in some of the Paramo, and they're just creeping with a lot of moss surrounding them. And here's just some more. And just the bracken fern, which it's kind of invasive. Nothing eats it. If cows eat it, they develop cancer. And in clear areas, it's been, it takes over. So this is in Colombia, and it's a big problem. This is just a general display of ferns from Bogota Botanic Gardens. So I had a chance to go there and got a chance to see some of their ferns on display in, with some of the names here and there, and the bird nest fern, and squirrel foot. And in Colombia Botanic Garden, you see the beautiful tree ferns right there, and right there. So I think with that, we'll end up the fern. Does anybody have any questions? If not, then we'll post this so that the rest of the class can see it. So any questions? All right, so I'll see you, whoever is going to return to the class later on, and I'll stop the recording so that we don't make it too long. All right, have a great day.